My name is Charity Counts. I'm the Executive Director of the Association of Midwest Museums. I'm joining you today from my home office, which has blue walls and white doors. I myself am a white woman with fair skin and dark hair with a white streak, and I'm wearing my Proud Museum Person shirt, which is my regular uniform for these events. It's great to see you and have you here with us today for Changing Hearts and Minds Through Art, our lightning talk by Carolyn Mazloomi. Before we begin today's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that while we are gathered today virtually, each of us joins from the unceded land of Indigenous peoples. The office of AMM is in Indianapolis, Indiana, the homeland of the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, Shawnee, Wee, and Kickapoo communities. I invite you to join me in acknowledging these and all other Midwestern Indigenous communities, their elders, both past and present, as well as future generations. AMM recognizes that our organization and many of our member institutions were founded within a colonizing society, which caused the exclusions and erasures of many Indigenous peoples throughout the Midwest and beyond. Thank you for helping us challenge these practices. I also want to offer a few housekeeping notes before we get started today. Today's lightning talk is hosted in Zoom webinar, as you know. This means you can see us, but we can't see you. We invite you to comment and exchange with your peers in the chat. If you have questions for our speaker today, though, please use the Q&A function, which you can find the button for Q&A in your menu at the bottom of the screen. Pose questions there, and if you like a question or want to see it bump to the top of the list, you can like it as well in the Q&A. Of course, we'll be watching the chat too for questions that come in there in hopes that we don't miss anybody who offered questions throughout the program. If you would prefer to ask your question out loud today, and maybe to provide some context for it or whatever it may be, I think for the number of folks that we have joining us today, it would be fine for me to unmute you and allow you to ask your question directly to Carolyn and our guests. So to do that, just raise your hand. You can use the reaction tool in your menu to raise your hand, and then I will unmute you temporarily so you can ask your question. We've also turned on the built-in Zoom live transcription feature. You can turn this off or on your end by clicking the CC button in your menu bar. We know this feature isn't perfect, and we'll do our best to communicate clearly today so that those of you who are following along with the transcript have the best experience possible. Okay, with that, let's move on to our program. I'd like to welcome a colleague and AMM member, Bill Raker from SAQA Global Exhibitions, who introduced us today's guest speaker, Carolyn, and also our specialists when it comes to quilt and textile art exhibitions, to provide some background and offer an introduction of Carolyn today. Bill?
Thank you, Charity. First of all, it's a great honor, and I'm really humbled to be able to introduce Carolyn. Back in winter, I was talking to Charity, and she was telling me about these events, and she asked me, do you know of an artist in the Midwest who would be interesting and have something to say to our members? And I said, absolutely. It took me about 2 seconds to say, Carolyn Mazloomi is who we want to talk with. And the programming she makes and the exhibitions she travels are wonderful. I do want to put a disclaimer. While I travel art quilt exhibitions, and we have 15 exhibitions traveling the globe right now, and I'd love to talk to any museum about them, that we are not traveling Carolyn's exhibitions, and I don't want to take any credit for them or any of the work she's doing. So I want us to put that out there. We have, in the past, Carolyn has juried and curated some of our exhibitions. And full disclosure, she was a board member of SAQA many years ago and did some wonderful work. So on her background, I can spend 2 days telling everybody how wonderful I think she is. She was trained as an aerospace engineer, and back in the 80s pushed over to being an artist. She's an artist, she's a curator, she manages exhibitions, she's an advocate. She founded the, I want to get the name exactly right, the Women of Color's Quilting Network back in the 80s. Her exhibitions have traveled to venues around the country, including the Renwick Gallery at the Smithsonian Institution. And in 2014, she was named the National Heritage Fellow by the National Endowment for Arts. And the list of awards and achievements are really long. But when I think about Carolyn, I mean, all these things come to mind. The UN has recognized her developmental programs and how they help women. But it's her voice and her spirit and her message. And when I talk to her, she's always kind and gracious and such a gentle person with such a great message and a great way to get it across. So to introduce her, I want to quote two of her own, two things she said in her own words that I think really speak to her. And number one is, as an artist, I strongly believe art has the capacity to touch the spirit, engage, educate, and heal in ways that words alone cannot. And then she said, I am drawn to vulnerable people, to disenfranchised, disposed, outsiders. The injustice and harsh realities of the daily lives of those in need motivate me to create artwork depicting their circumstances. There are people who deserve to be heard, seen, and understood, especially of women and children. On that theme, speaking of people that deserve to be heard, I'm proud to introduce Carolyn Mazloomi to you.
Thank you, Bill. And I'm happy to be here today, and thanks for inviting me to speak about a show that's dear to my heart, and of course involving quilts, which for me, quilts are just, they're a part of my very being here. I'm surrounded by them all the time and cannot picture my life without quilts and art, period. But this particular project is really a special project for me. The shocking murder of George Floyd, an African-American man who died as Officer Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for 9 minutes and 29 seconds in Minneapolis, not only shocked the nation, but angered people around the world. George Floyd is only the latest addition to a long list of victims of police brutality. Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Sandra Bland, Andre Morris Hill, Eric Gardner, Freddie Gray. These are just a few names of many. But the murder of George Floyd was different. It was condemned not only by citizens across social and political spectrums, but it caused protests and riots not seen in this country since the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. Not only were there protests in America, but Floyd's death resonated around the world. Around the globe, marches of solidarity and protest condemning racism and police brutality under the banner of Black Lives Matter took place. Mama, there's nothing more powerful to mobilize a collective of women than the cries of their children. Such cries serve as a herald, a call to arms for such a time as this. George Floyd's dying words ignited this call on behalf of every child that's ever suffered or succumbed to the evil trinity of brutality, inequity, and racism in America. A mother's first instincts are to protect, to comfort, and to teach. These are her counter trinity tools, and historically, quilting has long been deployed as the mother art, evoking these tools as a maternal response to a child's cry for protection and comfort, and to their need for learning. I always identify myself as an African-American woman born in the Jim Crow segregated South. And I continue to deal with the psychological and physical conditions of racism in this country. I grew up seeing African Americans treated poorly by whites, killed by whites, and denied access to proper housing, education, and health care. And racism in America is on the rise. And sometimes I feel like it's open season on Black folks. But all in all, I cried for days after seeing the video of George Floyd's murder. And the cry for his mother just broke my heart, okay? And it helped mirror a symbolic, it was a symbolic guttural cry, and that call for help just emanated from the belly of our nation. African Americans are crying out for fairness and justice and equality and protection from police brutality. And in response to that cry, and to help educate the public about police brutality and racism, I was inspired to create a series of 7 exhibitions. And they're under the umbrella of We Are the Story, a visual response to racism in America. I'm on the board of the Textile Center in Minneapolis. And I thought, well, Minneapolis is ground zero, okay? I had to involve the Textile Center in what I thought would be an opportunity to address racism. And it was a perfect place to start. So I asked the director at the Textile Center if he could help me find venues for these 7 exhibitions. 2 of them were juried exhibitions. 4 of the exhibitions were individual solo exhibitions. And 1 exhibition, the 7th, was an exhibition that I did 3 years ago to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the Freedom Riders. Anyway, it was interesting when I put out the call for the 2 jury shows. I did not expect to get such great response. I got almost 500 entries, and not only from here in the United States, but from around the world. And the one commonality those entries had from outside of the country, these artists were telling me, your story as a Black person, my story as a Black person living here in the United States is also their story. It's their story of a person of color living in Japan or England or Brazil, and they wanted to participate. So as a result, we had these 7 exhibitions that opened simultaneously at different museum venues, art centers around the Minneapolis area. And they were all dealing with some facet of racism, as well as one exhibition which memorialized people who had been killed by the police. Many people ask me, well, why use quilts to tell the story of issues of race in America? And that's an interesting question. I use quilts because quilting is one of America's most powerful art forms, with its widespread appeal and its association with comfort, warmth, and healing. Quilts and quilt making are especially important to African American culture, because that art form was historically one of the few mediums accessible to marginalized groups to tell their own story. It's not only about providing warmth to the family, but quilts empowered the maker with a voice. Through cloth, people can relate to history through their story quilts, as opposed to reading about history in ways that reach our hearts. Statistics show that the average American does not get their information about history or anything for that matter through reading. If anything, reading is the last thing we're going to do. But to disseminate a message visually it's an easy fix. And using the quilts, which is something that most individuals are familiar with. We're all familiar with cloth. It's the first thing we're swathed in at birth. It's the last thing to touch our bodies upon our death. But using quilts to tell these difficult, very, very difficult stories about racism and police brutality here in America, it's an easy way to tell a difficult story. I always say that the quilts are a soft place to land for these difficult stories. Everything seems to be more palatable in cloth form. So this is a non-threatening approach. It's a non-threatening approach to talk about these difficult subjects. So having the quilts in public spaces prompts a dialogue between the artist and the viewer. And these quilts challenge the existing notions and pose questions that serve to move the discussion of race reconciliation forward to a new generation of hopefully of problem solvers. Art is important. Art matters. For me as an artist and an organizer, I cannot be silent. Each exhibited quilt helps enrich every person that sees those quilts. They have the potential to advance the conversation and work towards shaping our human potential for the better. And people wonder, do the viewers get it? Do they understand what I'm trying to say as a curator? And I would think so, because I get letters all the time from viewers that have seen quilt shows that I've been involved in or quilt shows that I've curated. And they have been impacted by what they've seen. And when I get these letters, I also get a lot of hate mail too. But when I get these letters, I know they're watching, they're looking, they're paying attention. So even with the bad letters, coupled with the good, at least they're out there looking. Productive conversation is important, especially about race, and we have to start with honesty and respect for others and be open to ideas and information that provide new perspectives. We want to make sure that our stories as African Americans are seen in museums, and we want to uplift our race and not put a foot on them. Since George Floyd's murder, there was a groundswell of activism that sort of forced museums to confront their own historic complicity in racism and oppression. And many organizations expressed, not only museums, but corporations as well, expressed their solidarity and vowed to take action about racism. And there was a statement signed by the Museum Association and other heritage bodies that acknowledge that our nation's history and heritage is an invaluable tool in the fight against racism and discrimination. But simply removing inaccurate racist depictions of American history isn't enough. It's not enough. This is the reason why history and museum professionals across the country are looking for ways to tell a more complete story that centers Black voices after they've been silenced so long. So these quilts are a way to tell the stories of African Americans. The quilts were, in this particular show, most of the quilts were made by African Americans, but there are quilts in this exhibition that were made by whites as well. In fact, if you just hold the screen right here, this particular quilt is a quilt made by a white artist. And the white artists that are in this show, they are interested in promoting racial reconciliation, and their efforts when looking at this work are sincere. These are people that want change as well and have created art surrounding that change. So all of these voices, whether they're Black, white, Native American, Hispanic, there's one commonality: to end racism, to make quilts about these stories in hopes that we can end racism, or at least have people from outside of Black culture understand what it is to live in this skin and what we go through living every day in this country where sometimes we're targets. So each one of these quilts is a lesson. We can continue. Each one is a lesson in how to live our lives and what we go through as African Americans, and the story, history. I believe that if we knew each other's history, it would make life a little easier. When I was in school, elementary school, high school, and I'm 75, so you know that was a long, long time ago. No one was teaching anything about African American history. So most people from outside of the culture really don't know our history. So these quilts go a long way into making that happen and giving a glimpse into Black history. As these quilts, these are some of the quilts that are in the show. For the purpose of traveling, I had to choose 50 quilts out of almost 240 quilts. There are 50 quilts that are traveling in this exhibition. So they come from a mix of all the 7 exhibitions that were in Minneapolis. But it gives an overall flavor of all the exhibits that were there in Minneapolis. And I think the quilts in here are powerful, powerful stories of our life living in America as African Americans. At this time, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them.
Thank you for that great talk, Carolyn, and for the invitation for questions. Just to remind everyone, we'll of course look back through the chat for any questions that may have come up there, but we welcome you to use the Q&A function to submit your questions, or raise your hand if you would like to be able to ask your question aloud.
And I would have to say too, I just want to make note that these quilts that are pictured are part of the exhibition, We Are the Story, a visual response to racism. And this show will be traveling for the next 2.5 years around the country. It is scheduled to open July 1st at the Underground Railroad Freedom Center Museum in Cincinnati, Ohio. And it will be there through September. And then it will leave there and go to Florida, Sanibel, Florida. So we, as the Women of Color Quilters Network, it's their show. We try and make the rental fees so that small museums are able to have this show. The point of the show, we want people to see the show and look at the quilts and read the catalog. We want them to see our story and know what's going on. So we try and make it affordable to all museums. So
That's
I just
great.
wanted to let you know that.
That's great, Carolyn. I see Whitney from Cincinnati Museum Center has posted in the chat that they're looking forward to hosting.
Yes.
I had a couple questions come through Q&A related to We Are the Story. One of them is, it's so inspiring to see all this work. What locations showed the original 7 exhibitions in the past year?
They were in, let's see, they were in Minneapolis at the Textile Center at the University of Minnesota, and the Minneapolis Art Institute, the Swedish Art Center, Swedish American Art Center. And I had to get a copy of the catalog here. We have a wonderful catalog that accompanies this exhibition as well. So.
And then another question, Carolyn, is about a particular artist. Is it Sean Kimber? Is Sean Kimber's quilts in the exhibition?
No, Sean Kimber does not have a quilt in this show, but I love Sean Kimber's work, and she's in my personal collection. I collect quilts. I have over 700 of them. And 3 years ago, I gave a part of that collection to Michigan State. But anyway, Sean Kimber's in my collection and is a wonderful artist whose quilts focus on social justice issues.
Carolyn, listening to you speak, watching everything that happened around George Floyd, and not just sharing your voice, but documenting everybody's stories right now. I'm just comparing it to all the history that's just coming out about the Tulsa massacre and all the research and how silent that was, that people didn't know it happened. And how is that falls into your mission of telling people the story and keeping it from being unknown history. Can you respond to that?
Well, white people didn't know it happened, but
I'm sorry. Yes, 100% correct. Yes, I'm sorry.
I have had quilts in shows for the past 20 years that dealt with that subject. In fact, there are quilts in this show that deal with the massacre, the burning of Black Wall Street. In fact, because my shows deal with social justice issues, I can say the last 20 years, the shows I've done, there's always somebody that has a quilt in there about the burning of Black Wall Street. Because for us as African Americans, we know that history, and it's a recurring visual theme in a lot of my shows. So I'm glad at this point that it's getting national attention, because it's another story that might make a difference in how people feel when it comes to the topic of racism.
Carolyn, I've got a question about the We Are the Story exhibition. You know, it's been about a year now since you first started working on that. Is there a moment with the exhibition that has really stuck with you in the past year, whether it was, a visitor?
I would say what has really stuck out in my mind, how the murder of George Floyd resonated around the world and not just here in the United States. And that was borne out in the participation by people from other countries in this exhibition, We Are the Story. That was memorable, and it was eye-opening to see that influence being worldwide.
That's great.
So racism isn't just our problem here in the United States,
Yeah. Well, and that brings me to another question I had. You talked a lot about how participants and artists who contributed to the exhibitions were from around the world. Did you also see like a diversity of ages and races, across the globe participating in this? And
well, when it comes to quilt making, I hate to say it, I don't see that many young people. Oh. Young for me means anybody 50 and that's young. In fact, the average age of people in the Women of Color Quilters Network is 75 to 102.
Wow.
Okay, so quilt making has not attracted many young people, but they're coming. I see a few on the horizon that are in their 30s, so that's refreshing. So they're starting to come.
That's really, I'm actually kind of surprised. I feel like I know so many people who do some sort of, textile or fiber sort of art themselves, or have been practicing, especially in the past year.
Oh, the quilting, I mean, it has trended older for a long time. And they are seeing some younger groups form. And we're seeing in the colleges and universities, people are coming out with MFA degrees, understanding what textile arts are and expanding and exploring into them. So where the current group are, the older generation, I want to say, came more from quilting, where we're seeing is people coming from art into quilting in the future group that's coming up. And it's really helping people, I'm going to use Carolyn as a great example, share her story, share her love of this art with these younger people coming in from a different angle. And it's just great to see.
Well, and related to that, I think it's wonderful the different types of locations that the exhibition's been at, Carolyn, because, being on a university campus and being at different museums in the cities, I imagine the exhibition's been able to, touch the lives of people from all backgrounds and ages.
Yes. And well, that's the purpose. That's the purpose of showing the art, to make sure that it goes to a variety of institutions to reach as many people possible.
Yeah, that's great. I saw another question come into the Q&A. I'm excited about your work as a curator and quilter, and I'm so grateful for your voice. Where is a good place for young quilters to get their feet wet?
Can I take this one, Carolyn, please?
Oh, yes.
All right. For a young art quilter to get their feet wet, I would go to www.saqa.com. It's actually my umbrella organization, Studio Art Quilt Associates. And it's an organization of 4,000 art quilters around the world, with a huge presence in different regions. I mean, we're really big in the Midwest, and you've got everything from world-renowned artists to people just beginning. And what we find when we, we've got a big presence in the museum industry world, we've got a big presence in quilt shows around the world. And when we go to these quilt shows and we hang up our art quilts, we always have people say, "Oh, I'm an artist. That's what I'm doing." And they take that leap from quilting into art. So I would definitely, send them over www.saqa.com, and we'll get them in the right way. And as I said, we're traveling any given year. We open 4 to 5 new show exhibitions. We're traveling 17 a year, as they travel for 3 years, we have 17 to 18 traveling. So 50 art quilts per exhibition. It's a lot of opportunity for people to, get out there, get the exposure, and work with people like Carolyn and other people who are established, who are more than willing to share with the young artists and give them, their start.
Thank you, Bill. Carolyn, anything you would like to add?
Well, I would agree with Bill. SAQA is a good place to start. And there's always classes going on around the country. So it's easy to find classes and someone to work with through SAQA.
Great. Well, I don't see any new questions from the Q&A. So to kind of wrap us up a little bit here, I wanted to ask about the other exhibitions that you have touring. Where might people find information about that?
I just finished I am working on a project for the James Museum of Western and Wildlife Art in Florida. And the topic is African Americans and the settling of the West. And that show is going to open the summer of next year. And it will be my final exhibition. I'm retiring.
Wow.
And they're trying to anyway. But it will be my last curated exhibition. And I will be hanging up my needles.
Oh, wow. Well, thanks for letting us know. Hopefully we can get to that exhibition. Of course, for everybody in the Midwest, if you can make it to Cincinnati to check out We Are the Story, if you missed it in Minnesota, definitely would love to see you all there. Carolyn, did you want to add anything?
Yes, someone mentioned the exhibition of Bisa Butler's quilts at the Art Institute. And Bisa Butler was my mentee for about 12 years and a member of got her start with the Women of Color Quilters Network. And she is just a powerhouse when it comes to art quilts, and just a very popular artist right now, doing extraordinary work. So I'm very happy for Bisa and very proud of her.
I bet you are. That's amazing. Wonderful. Well, I will say, Carolyn, thank you again for being with us today and sharing, this project in Minnesota, We Are the Story, with us, and, the work that you do and your perspective. And you said something about quilt art being a soft place to land for these stories, and that's going to stick with me. I know, I'm sure with others. We've all heard you today, your inspiring message. So thanks so much for being here. Bill, thank you again for introducing us to Carolyn and helping to make this lightning talk possible. And I wish everybody here with us today, the best of luck in your work to dismantle racist systems and practices at your institutions and in your communities. And hopefully you can get some inspiration here today for how art and exhibitions can help with the conversation and make, move the needle, as it were. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.